All right, why don't we get started? I want to welcome everybody to the Heartland Institute's summer webinar series. I am Cameron Schulte, the Director of Government Relations, and I am joined by Tim Benson and James Taylor. Want to thank everybody for joining us. We'll be recording this and we'll make it available on our webpage and on our YouTube page for those who want to watch it. And then we'll also distribute it in our weekly leaflet that we send out to legislators. Today, we're going to get into the IPCC report. This was their sixth assessment, and we wanted to do a bit of a dive with Tim and James and why it's important for state lawmakers to be familiar and be aware of what's in that report. And of course, what isn't in that report. So with that, I'm actually just going to hand it over to Tim Benson, our policy analyst at Heartland, who will then introduce James, our president.
Well, hi, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today. We're glad you could make it. We know you're probably tired of sitting on Zoom meetings and Zoom calls and everything, but so we appreciate your time here, and we'll get right into it. So yeah, just 10 days ago, the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is colloquially known as IPCC, released its sixth assessment report on the climate, which is known as AR6. As Cameron mentioned, this is a pretty big deal. These reports are not that frequent. The previous report, AR5, was published in 2014, so that's 7 years ago. And the first one was published back in 1990. So we've had 6 reports in 31 years. So meaning we basically get one of these about every half decade or so. So I know August 9th already seems like a lifetime ago. The release of this report has gotten somewhat buried in the news cycle, first by the resignation of Governor Cuomo in New York, and then the swift collapse of the Afghan government in the face of the Taliban, and the ensuing chaos that we're watching every day. But still, the report is certain to have probably a significant impact on how government entities in the Western world are going to choose policies to respond to climate change or the perceived threat of climate change. So are these predictions in the report and the conclusions reached in the report, are these trustworthy to base policy on? So that's what we're going to talk about today, and that's why we have Heartland President James Taylor here he's here with us to let you know what's in the report, what it says, what it doesn't say, what you need to know about it so that you can make intelligent decisions on policy in your home states. So without further ado, we'll just hand it over to James. So go ahead, James, take it away.
All right. Thank you so much, Tim and Cameron. And thank you, everybody who is here on this webinar. The first thing that's really important to note is that this is a report that the media and that political proponents of the asserted climate crisis are going to try to use to bash over your head, to give you the gotcha questions and the gotcha attacks about the so-called climate crisis. But this is a report that's really of the bureaucrats, for the bureaucrats, by the bureaucrats, and also for the media, I guess. To properly respond to the gotcha questions that are going to be given to you, keep in mind we have 2 very important websites at the Heartland Institute that you should be familiar with. The first one is climateataglance.com. And in climateataglance.com, we have by topic, so by hurricanes, tornadoes, droughts, wildfires, what have you. We have approximately 40 to 50 of the most talked about and frequently asserted climate topics, in which we provide 1-2-page summaries. So it's not going to require a lot of time or digesting material, but it gives you straightforward what the truth is, what the facts are. So please make yourself familiar with climateataglance.com. This is your resource for responding to the attempted gotcha questions and attacks that will come as a result of this UN report. Also, we have a website, climaterealism.com. And here what we do is every day we are monitoring Google News and other internet entities for what the climate activists are proposing each day as their climate message of the day, the climate scare of the day. And we will identify it and take it apart. So again, when you get hit with the gotcha questions, well, this report, this study just came out, or this is in the news, you'll know what the truth is. So climateataglance.com and climaterealism.com. Now, getting to the UN report, Tim did a good job of introducing what the report is. And the United Nations puts this out again every several years. And again, it's designed, keep in mind the name of the UN IPCC. It's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Emphasis on intergovernmental. This is designed to give governments cover for climate activism. This is not a report that is very scientific in terms of objectivity and participation of all points of view. It's not scientific in the sense that science really is the scientific method where we encourage the strong and severe testing of hypotheses. This is designed to present a consensus notion for moving forward with climate activism. But even so, there's only so much that the authors of these reports and this most current report can do to paint the current situation as a climate crisis. In fact, they present quite a bit of evidence that is quite useful and appropriate for climate realists who are a little bit skeptical of the asserted climate crisis. So what you see in the news media is you see the quotes or summaries of the summary for policymakers. Now, the report itself that IPCC has published is nearly 4,000 pages. Now, no one's going to read 4,000 pages. Believe me, I've tried. I've read several hundred pages and I've scanned the rest, but reading 4,000 is quite a bit. So they put out this summary for policymakers that they expect the media to pick up and the politicians to adhere to. But the summary for policymakers is not a very accurate reflection of what is reported in the 4,000 pages. So if you read the summary for policymakers and if you follow the media coverage of it, it is a litany of one disaster after another that is either here right now or is coming. And the emphasis in the actual text, though, is what they predict might be happening. Because in the 4,000 page text, when they discuss hurricanes, tornadoes, droughts, wildfires, just like the last report, they have very little evidence that global warming is making any of these entities, extreme weather events, worse. In the 2018 interim report, their last full report, as Tim mentioned, was in 2014. In 2018, the United Nations IPCC put out an interim report, and it stated explicitly in the report itself, with the science backing it up, that they had very little confidence in any evidence that global warming has made hurricanes worse. They had very little confidence in any evidence that global warming has made tornadoes worse, or droughts worse, or floods worse, or wildfires worse. All you had basically was an affirmation that those extreme weather events are either not getting any worse or are in fact becoming less frequent and severe, along with predictions, because they've been predicting this for 30 years, that, oh wait, but soon, very soon it's going to change. Have the laws of physics been on vacation for 30 years? If it was going to get worse, they would have gotten worse by now. Here in this most recent report that the IPCC released, you have essentially the same thing. There's a little bit more when you look at the actual 4,000 pages. And for me, what I've been focusing on is chapter 11, where they talk about what they have observed today in terms of these weather and climate events. They do a little bit more of, for example, they'll say something like, well, we have observed an increase in hurricane strength in the North Atlantic, which is another way to say, we don't see any increase across the board globally, but in one region, because some regions will sometimes be stronger than others. In one region, by the way, a region in which nobody lives, we see some strengthening, but in other regions, we don't see it. In fact, we see a weakening. And that's the case pretty much across the board. The actual report itself affirms that scientists to date have found little or no increase in severity of extreme weather or climate events. In fact, at the same time, we do know that crop production continues to improve each and every year because carbon dioxide is atmospheric fertilizer, plus a warmer climate with fewer frost events and more precipitation, which they document in the report. There is more abundant precipitation globally, is good for crops. We also know that forests have been expanding throughout across the globe. There's been a tremendous greening of the earth. That is also reported. These are the things that the media does not alert you to. So I don't want to go on too long, just giving a monologue about the report. I look forward to interacting via questions and all, but the things to keep in mind, first and foremost, when you're worried about the gotcha questions, go to climateataglance.com. That's really should be your primary source, so that you'll have, with just a few bullet points along with the backup information to know you're getting good information. This is how you rebut the alarmist gotcha questions. And the report itself, again, tell people, read the actual report rather than the summary for policymakers, because the science presented in the report itself is actually not very alarming. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Tim, and I'm happy to take questions, assuming the format permits it.
Yeah. Now, a couple things. I was thinking. You mentioned that what's said in the summary for policymakers, the sort of cliff notes of the report. The only thing the IPCC probably expects anybody to actually read that isn't a climate scientist or what have you. What is said in the summary for policymakers is different than what is actually in the report itself. And then the media are picking up on this and saying, that the climate situation is extremely dire. Humans are entirely to blame for the climate issue, and that, we're essentially out of time to solve the problem. But in fairness to the journalists, I mean, the UN sort of stokes this as well. The Secretary General called this report a code red for humanity. But this is something, I mean, the UN's been doing this, these sort of doom and gloom scenarios over the environment, not just climate, global warming, but also global cooling and all that stuff going back 50 years. And, 2007, the former IPCC chairman warned that basically if there's no action by 2012, then it's too late for humanity on the planet. He said basically what we do between 2007 and 2012 is going to decide the fate of humanity. And obviously we're it's 2021 and we're still here and kicking. So who do you think who's more to blame, do you think, than for this sort of scaremongering? Do you think that it's the media or the UN? Because I mean, the media, in fairness to them, these are mostly people that don't have a background in climate science or anything like that, and they're just sort of regurgitating what's told to them to the UN. Is the UN more at fault for this, for making or sort of stating things in the summaries for policymakers than what's actually in the report?
Yeah, well, the answer is yes, they both are. Is it the journalists, or is it the IPCC? Yes, it is. It's both of them. I mean, really, this is, as I stated earlier, this is a report that is of the bureaucracy, for the bureaucracy, by the bureaucracy. You have, in the past 30 years or so, you've seen a tremendous growth in the United Nations climate bureaucracy. When you look at the authors that they list, and the authors, they have lead authors, contributing authors, assistant lead authors, they have contributors. The number of people that contribute to this report is in the thousands. And they have, for many of these people, they are receiving quite a bit of money, either directly to produce the report or their institutions, given money by the United Nations. This is a cash cow for these scientists and their affiliated groups. They hold these conferences every year. The biggest one that you'll see in the media occurs usually it's November, usually at some nice place that people want to go visit. And it's 2 weeks on the taxpayer dime, where they get to talk about how great they are saving the earth. And the media puts these superhero capes on these nerds. If you're a scientist, you're basically a nerd. That's okay. I like the science too. So this is a report that really needs to justify the perpetuation of the bureaucracy. If and when the climate crisis is shown overwhelmingly, I think it already has been shown overwhelmingly that it's not going to occur. Then all of these positions, all of these agencies, all of these jobs and budgetary distributions go away. And the media, now that's the UN's part, the media, of course, the mainstream media leans left anyway. On top of that, sensationalism sells. if you produce reports saying, hey, guess what? Actually, things aren't going to be that bad. You're not going to have thousands of articles that people are going to read all the time in breathtaking anticipation and fear. They must read it to know what's going to happen to them. This is what the media does, both in terms of what the media is and the ideology, the leftist ideology of the media itself. But fortunately, there are tools to combat this. The scientific method tells us that if you have a hypothesis, then you should be vigorously challenging it yourself, and you should be encouraging others to do the same. Now, the United Nations doesn't do this. Climate activists don't adhere to the scientific method, but nevertheless, climate realists, scientists around the world do so. And the science that takes apart the alarmist narrative is readily available. And we present it at climateataglance.com. If you go to NIPCC.com, NIPCC, the non-governmental, as opposed to the intergovernmental, the non-governmental International Panel on Climate Change has produced several reports. I have one sitting over my shoulder, as you can see, that present the science that people need to know. You can also look up why scientists disagree about global warming. That's a book that the Heartland Institute published. If you do an internet search for that, why scientists disagree about global warming, again, you get the facts. And I believe sometimes people get very discouraged and frustrated because the media imposes a blackout on climate realist information. Our children are just presented with one-sided propaganda in the schools. And many of my friends and allies get very depressed about it and think that we're losing. Well, we're never going to win on those fronts. And they're becoming more aggressive over time against us. But I think the American people are intelligent and they're discerning. There is a reason why, although people generally believe that the earth is warming, which it is, why people generally believe that humans are playing a role, which they likely are. People also at the same time understand that it's not a severe crisis. It's not something that's going to impact them severely during their lifetimes. Polling shows that, and people won't pay more than $10 a month to address it. Again, reflecting that people realize that, you know, when you overshoot the target over and over and over again, people start tuning it out and they start looking up and realizing what the facts are. And that's one of the reasons why this current report, the sixth assessment report, is not getting much media coverage. As you mentioned, Andrew Cuomo and Afghanistan are two factors. But still, even for people that are paying attention to the news cycle beyond that, it's like, yeah, I've seen this before. And this is no new song and dance.
Yeah, I was going to say they even before all this stuff started happening in the news cycle, there was sort of a couple stories coming out about how AR6 just sort of came out with a whimper instead of the bang that they thought it was, and how people just sort of just like, oh, it's another oh, here we are, another doom and gloom climate prediction from the UN. Okay, so they're pretty pretty much used to the Chicken Little routine at this point. But speaking AR6 in general, the big difference between AR6 and the previous ARs is that AR6 basically removes the possibility, or pretty much removes the possibility, that that natural factors have anything more than like a marginal effect on the climate. So AR6 is basically saying, no, it's pretty much all human. But they, so I was, when I was reading over the summary for policymakers when this came out, I was just flipping through it and I was like, I don't see anything about clouds in here. And I, did a, control search, and, the word cloud appeared twice in the summary for policymakers, and that was in the footnote to a couple different graphs. So it didn't actually appear in like the body of the text at all. This is, and we know clouds are the, water vapor is the biggest greenhouse gas. It accounts for what, 96–97% of all greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So obviously clouds have a huge impact in the long term and short term on surface temperature. And then the same thing, but IPCC acknowledged that in previous ARs. But again, in AR6, they sort of virtually ignore any effect the sun has on climate change. Solar irradiance, which is basically that's the output of light energy from the sun. They're saying that doesn't have really very much role in climate change, or any role at all in climate change. They don't mention solar cycles. or the increases and decreases in cosmic rays from solar fluctuations, all this sort of thing that you would, it's just sort of common sense that sort of affects the climate of the Earth. So why is this sidelining of the impact natural factors have on climate change? Why is, in your mind, is that a problem for IPCC's narrative, and why is that so?
Yeah, propaganda, pure and simple. Perpetuate the notion of a crisis so we can perpetuate these agencies, these jobs, this prominence, this star power, these budgets. But the sun, the sun, for centuries, for millennia, for eons, the sun has been the prominent determinant of how much energy is reaching the Earth and how much temperature change we are having. The sun does not produce energy at a constant rate from second to second, minute to minute, day to day, month to month, year to year. It does not. Scientists have documented that. We have had, the Earth's history has not been one of a constant temperature, constant, not changing, and then all of a sudden SUVs and coal-fired power plants and changing that. Scientists have documented in the very first IPCC assessment report, they produce a chart and data that confirmed what scientists have long known as quote unquote settled science. They have long known that the Earth's temperatures have changed quite a bit over time. That change in temperature has been very closely correlated and almost for sure caused by changes in solar output. And indeed, during the course of human civilization, if we go back over the last 6, 7, 8,000 years, for most of that time period, temperatures were warmer than they are today. How can you have a global warming crisis when temperatures are abnormally cool, not warm? Now, the warming that we've had that the UN IPCC 6th assessment report talks about as a code red, it's because they're making their temperature comparisons to what temperatures were 150 years ago. Now, 150 years ago, the Earth was in the final stages of the Little Ice Age. That was the coldest period of the past 10,000 years. That was a period that brought famine, plague, climate-related misery, more extreme weather events, more severe than is the case today. It's a good thing that we're warming from the Little Ice Age. It's to be expected that with each succeeding decade, as we continue our recovery, that this decade's a little warmer than last decade, and that's a little warmer than the previous one. But it's not a sign of record warm ever temperatures. It's a sign of warming from the Little Ice Age. We'd have to warm at our current pace for another century or two to even reach the temperatures that existed during early human civilization and that were so conducive to human civilization without all the technologies we have today. So far from being a climate crisis, the mere facts that one, the Earth is warming, and two, that humans may be playing some role, that doesn't mean we're facing a climate crisis. Scientists know that, and I think most of the public knows that.
Okay. We have a question from Ron Meyer, one of our attendees, and he's asking, given the IPCC's ClimateGate hockey stick temperature model scandal of 10 years ago or so, how does the IPCC retain any credibility? And just to add to that, to add to his question, about the climate models IPCC relies on, there was a couple, was it in June or July? Basically, the scientists and modelers who constructed the models that IPCC uses for these ARs, they basically were forced to admit that they grossly overestimated past and projected warming. Actually, their models are actually performing worse than now than they were 20, 30 years ago. And they actually admitted this in Science, which is the peer-reviewed journal of science. So can you just, so just for Mr. Meyer's question, what's going on with the models? Like I said, what's
Sure.
credibility?
The models and the hockey sticks. So the models, first of all, scientists have known, they've documented going back over 30 years now, beyond 30 years, that these models that we were told to rely on for future warming have been running exceedingly hot. The real world temperature increase that we've seen over the past 30 years is only about half of what the models predicted. It's very modest. It's been relatively steady. There's no indications of any rapid acceleration that's likely to come. And that pace is about maybe a little under 1.5 degrees of warming per century. And again, we'd have to warm at that pace for another century or two at least before we reach temperatures that predominated during early human civilization. In fact, the discrepancy between the IPCC early model predictions versus reality became so striking and embarrassing that just before this report came out, Tim, as you referenced, that there was an article, I think it was in Science or Nature, one of the scientific publications, in which you had prominent climate activists, scientists saying, well, this is really something that's becoming embarrassing and we're going to have to address. Obviously, the models are wrong. So now you come out with the sixth assessment report just a week after you had that article and those admissions by top prominent scientists who believe in a climate crisis. And the sixth assessment report states, we're more confident than ever in our climate models. And by the way, our climate models are predicting an even hotter future than we predicted last time. It's just completely divorced from reality.
To say, why not go? I mean, if they know the models are wrong or running hot, then
it's all about the money, baby.
If you have this report and the models are running hot, how do you issue the report when you know the models are wrong?
To justify this, keep the money coming in. And then the question referenced the hockey stick temperature model. So there was a scientist who basically nobody knew of, a young scientist who had really no stature anywhere, who back, I don't know, must have been 10, 15 years ago, came out with this paper. And what he asserted was that basically he looked at a narrow range of trees primarily, and that weren't very good indicators of temperature, and only for certain parts of the world, not very widespread. And said, based upon that, it shows that temperatures have been uniformly, modestly declining for 1,000 years. And then all of a sudden humans got involved and we have this huge spike in temperatures that takes us far above anything that we've experienced in the past 1,000 years. And they call it the hockey stick because it looked like a hockey stick where you go down, 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 and then up, the blade at the end. Well, it's funny because there was a commission, Congress created a commission, the Wegman Commission, that was comprised of especially statistical scientists as well as scientists from other fields that took a look at that hockey stick report because it was very controversial. It was not subjected to much scrutiny outside of folks who have a dog in the fight and want to say there's a climate crisis. And the Wegman Commission, independent commission, said this is garbage. They pointed out substantial flaws in the hockey stick. It had no basis in reality. They had merged data from different sources to make the stick appear like a hockey blade at the end. And really any data you plugged in, they determined based on the statistical model would put out that same result. It wasn't a data-driven hockey stick. It was a programmatic-driven hockey stick, among the many flaws. So yes, and what's interesting, and the question asks, how does the IPCC retain any credibility? It doesn't among scientists who don't have a dog in the fight, who are actually looking at the issue itself based on the merits. But it's interesting in that here in the sixth assessment report, so the hockey stick came out, and when it first came out in a prior report, I believe it was 2 reports ago. Since then, the United Nations IPCC has been pretty silent on the hockey stick itself. It hasn't really featured the hockey stick like it did the first time, largely because of the criticism, the justified criticism of it. Here in this current report, you see the hockey stick presented again. Now it comes back out of the blue after it had long since been forgotten. It shows up in the summary for policymakers, but it's not in the report itself, because in the report itself, they'd actually have to justify its use and its accuracy, which is impossible to do. But they put it in the summary for policymakers to put a scare into people. Look at this chart showing how horrible global warming is and how unprecedented it is. When even in the very first United Nations IPCC assessment report, the settled science showed from many sources, many ways of measuring climate, many studies, many sources, that temperatures were warmer than today for most of the period of human civilization. That still stands.
Okay, so if you were a state lawmaker, if you're out in your district and you're at an event with your constituents, you're giving as the town hall or, just out there speaking. So if you're discussing climate change, what would be the points you'd want to make to your constituents about climate change when you're discussing this?
All right, great question. And not just the points to make, but when you ask that question, I'm thinking gotcha questions that you get. That's their favorite tactic. Surprise you with the gotcha question. And as you're racking your brain with how to describe something that's a complex scientific issue, they make you look like a fool. You need to be prepared for it. So 3 things. Number 1, as I've said before, the first point you should always make, whether you're giving a talk or if you're addressing a gotcha question, is this: how can we be experiencing a global warming crisis when temperatures are unusually cool, not warm? Again, it's a fact. It's there in the very first IPCC assessment report. For most of human civilization, temperatures have been warmer than today. We cannot have a global warming crisis if temperatures are unusually cool. So that's number 1. Number 2, most importantly, as a result of the scientific data, but also even the IPCC admits in its last report quite clearly and unequivocally, and even here in this report, the extreme weather events that we're told will be so destructive to society are not occurring, or at least they're not occurring in any stronger or more frequent manner than was the case in the past. So again, the extreme weather events that we hear about are predictions that have not come true, and the objective data bear it out. And the third point I would make is that take a look at all of the benefits that you don't hear about in the media. Crop production globally and in almost every nation in the world is making long-term gains due to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which is plant fertilizer, and better weather conditions. There's a tremendous greening of the earth that NASA's satellites have measured, and they've attributed specifically to more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Deserts are shrinking throughout the globe. Forests are expanding. There's more greenery. It's a proven fact. And cold kills 20 times more people globally than heat. Cold kills more people in the United States than heat. It's in the Centers for Disease Control monthly mortality data. With a modestly warming world, we don't have as many cold deaths. We might have a very few more heat deaths, but we have mitigated and avoided many, many, many more cold deaths. So point number 1, you can't have a global warming crisis if temperatures are not unusually warm. Point number 2, the asserted harms simply have not occurred. We have the data to prove it. Point number 3, we're experiencing many benefits specifically due to global warming.
Okay, we have another question from one of our attendees from Jerry Rawls. He wants to know, how is the Earth's temperature determined for all the historical plots of temperature? Is it an average average of temperature at a specific location? Is there general agreement on the plots of Earth's temperature over millions of years? And following up on that, was 2020 really the hottest year in the last 1,000 years?
2020, I'll take the last question first. It's highly unlikely 2020 was the hottest temperature of the last 1,000 years. We being the Earth, we benefited from the medieval warm period, which lasted from approximately the year 900 or 1,000 when it began until about the year 1250 or so. Temperatures there during the medieval warm period, there were settlements in Greenland that are still buried under snow and ice. People were able to settle areas of Greenland that they cannot do today. When some of the ice and snow is melting in Greenland, it's revealing these settlements that thrived in warmer climates. In the British Isles, they were able to cultivate wine-producing grapes that you cannot do today. We see for example, in the Sierra Nevada mountains, we have evidence of ancient stands of trees that currently could not grow because it's too cold. We see evidence like that all around the world. So just during the medieval warm period, temperatures were significantly warmer than today. And the medieval warm period wasn't even nearly as warm as temperatures that existed 4,000, 5,000, and 6,000 years ago. So we have quite a ways to go in terms of, to reach temperatures that have predominated during the course of human civilization, when we had very little technology to deal with it, and yet humans thrived. As far as how is the Earth's temperature determined historically, there are many different ways, and depending on how far back you want to go. The one that I think is most pertinent and relevant to us here today is ice cores that are drilled in the Greenland and the Antarctic ice sheet. So basically, scientists can drill down through the ice and they can go back to as long as the ice sheet has existed. Now, the Earth has been in an ice age for 3 million years, and we still are in an ice age. And during that period, we have periods of about 100 to 150,000 years of advancing cold and advancing ice sheets. Then we have periods that average about 10,000 years. They vary from a few thousand years to 25,000 years, but on average 10,000 years. They call them interglacial warm periods, where temperatures warm up dramatically. And then after that 10,000 years or so, we go into another 100, 150,000 years of cooling. That's been the cycle for 3 million years. We're currently in an interglacial warm period, and we have been for 10,000 years. Historically speaking, we are due for our next ice age glaciation. I'm much more concerned about that when an ice sheet would cover all of Canada and where bitter tundra-like conditions would occur throughout the United States. Imagine the impact on crop production, et cetera, of that, as well as just land being swallowed by ice. I'm much more worried about that than the 2 degrees of warming that may occur in the next century and a half. But anyway, so how they determine it, they drill the ice cores into these ice sheets that have been in existence for hundreds of thousands of years. And then they sample oxygen isotopes that are an excellent proxy for global temperatures. And so by looking at the oxygen isotopes, and they can go back, the further down the ice core, the further back in history, they can see how temperatures have changed over time. The Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets are in agreement. Some people will say, well, because oftentimes it's the Greenland ice sheets that are presented, or it's the Antarctic ice sheets. Well, that could be just that one location. Just by some happenstance, Greenland happened to get lucky when the rest of the world was experiencing something different. No, it's Greenland and Antarctica in sync. And what they show is, as I've stated, that over the past 10,000 years, most of that time period, temperatures have been warmer than today. By the way, the last 4 interglacial warm periods, temperatures were significantly warmer than they are today. So even if we go back further in history, we're not in some unusually warm interglacial warm period. And by the way, during those interglacial warm periods, when we hear about species extinctions and polar bears can't handle it, et cetera, those species primarily existed back then. Polar bears evolved during a time period that was before the last interglacial ice age. So they survived the last warm period. And those interglacial periods, the advancing glaciations and interglacial warm periods, those entailed tremendously rapid and severe changes in temperature when we came in and out of those glaciations. Again, we're not facing anything close to a scale of change as what's occurred in the past. So by that measure, historically, we know that temperatures have been warmer in the past. We're not going to reach those temperatures anytime in the next few centuries. 3 centuries from now, we're not going to be burning coal and oil for energy, most likely. We're not facing the crisis that they say is the case. Historically, we know that's the case.
Okay. Well, we're getting pretty close to the end here, so unless we get any more questions from our attendees, I guess this will be the final question we have for you. So is there anything in AR6 that can be used by policymakers, by lawmakers in their state capitals or in DC? Is there anything useful in this report? Does it have any redeeming information or qualities to it? Is there anything useful from AR6?
Well, if you have the patience and the time on your hands, or if you have a teenage son or daughter with time on their hands, you can say drill into chapter 11 of the 4,000-page report. That's where the specific scientific reports are on hurricanes, tornadoes, et cetera. And you'll find many useful bits of information in summary in which they contradict what's asserted in the summary for policymakers and what the media states. But you also, Tim, you bring to mind, I have so many things here at the Heartland Institute that we'd like to do. So here's another one. Perhaps we can put out Anthony Watts, Sterling Burnett, and I. Perhaps we can put out a short summary of here's the usefulness of AR6, things that you should be aware of, in which we document what's in the report that contradicts the summary for policymakers. But certainly, if you're a legislator or for any other reason, if you'd like, hey, I'd like to know what really is the realist message in here, what's getting buried, get in touch with us. Get in touch with Cameron or Tim or me, and perhaps we can put that together for you as well.
Yeah, we just got a question in asking where they can get the full AR6 report. We can provide that for you. I forget the website off the top of my head.
An easy internet search, as I pulled this up again to review before, I just typed in IPCC AR6, boom, it was the top item. But I don't know why people would want to look it up, because it's garbage. But I guess there's some stuff in there that we can use ourselves.
Right. And then one more question from Jerry Rawls. He said a NOVA video on PBS showed ice core data that proved carbon dioxide increase is followed by temperature increase. This is opposite of the data shown by Greenland ice cores taken by climate skeptics. Who is right?
Yeah, great question. And I've seen the PBS show. I haven't seen it recently enough to say definitively, here is the specific point they made. Oftentimes what happens is this, whether it's PBS or others, they will show the ice core process, and then they will show a chart of how carbon dioxide levels have changed, which they can derive from the ice core as well as temperatures. And what they'll do, I'll put my two fingers up here, instead of having together on the same plane in the chart, the same line, how CO2 and temperatures go up and down, they'll put one above the other and do it like this. So you see the correlation, but you really have to look closely to see which one is coming first and which one's coming last. It's indisputed when you look at the record. Even if you look at Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth movie, Hollywood production, if you look closely at how he presents it, which is the same way, like this, you can see that the CO2 changes always follow the temperature changes. And the reason for this is simple. If we have a warming of the earth, historically due almost entirely to changes in solar output, when you have that warming, you have carbon dioxide that's being released from the oceans and it goes into the atmosphere. When you have cooling, the ocean holds more carbon dioxide. It sinks into the oceans and isn't released. Now, look, CO2 is a greenhouse gas. It's going to have some marginal impact on temperatures that will follow, but far the far greater impact comes first from the warming that is disassociated from carbon dioxide. Then the carbon dioxide trends follow. And by the way, if indeed we had a planet where we're often told, well, once you have this change in temperature, once you have some warming, it's going to lead to the unlocking of methane in the Arctic tundra. It's going to cause changes in cloud cover that accentuate warming as well. They always say just it's going to get worse and worse on this cycle. Well, if that were the case, the first time we ever had any warming in the Earth's history, it would have led to an out of control oven like Venus. The first time we had cooling from any region, from any reason, would have caused an out of control, irreconcilable, unsolvable Earth snowball. But that hasn't happened. The Earth's climate is resilient. And I mean, it's not like we made it this way. It's just, fortunately, it's the way it is, or we would never have been here in the first place. It has internal controls on temperatures increasing and decreasing. And part of that is evidenced in when we see that carbon dioxide levels follow temperature changes. Historically, it's proven. It's a fact. It's not the other way around.
Okay, great. Seeing no more questions, and as we've already gone about
well, hey, climateataglance.com, climaterealism.com. I'm going to plug those two because everybody should know about them, and visit Climate Realism every day and have climateataglance.com at their fingertips at all times. Sorry to interrupt, but it was worth it.
Yeah, no problem. So with that, I guess I'll just turn it back over to you, Cam, and you can wrap up for us if you want.
All right, thanks. Great job, guys. I actually listen to these and always learn something new. So I work with you on a daily basis, so I appreciate the refresher in the deep dive. Speaking of deep dives, if anybody that attended or watches this wants this on steroids, I encourage you to consider registering for our ICCC 14 event, which is in Las Vegas, October 15th to the 17th. If you have questions about that, there's a link in the chat, and you can visit our website, heartland.org. I've also given out Tim and James and my email. So if you have any questions about anything you heard today or about anything else you want us to talk smart on, just let us know. And with that, I will actually wind this down. Thank everybody for participating. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, James. Always good to have you. And thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your week, and we'll talk to you all soon.
Thank you, everyone.